Anyway, this is week 4 in my Proverbs series, and today we're talking about humor and humility in Proverbs. Some of the humor I think in Proverbs involves animals, so I'll explain the animal imagery. Proverbs might not naturally seem to you to be a humorous book, but I hope I can convince you that there are elements of humor and that the humor is used sometimes for ethical purposes. I have a prayer for us today. I found online in a Holy Humor liturgy. We don't celebrate that Holy Humor Sunday at our church, I guess, but some people do. And so I found this in that liturgy. So please pray with me. God of grace, God of love and laughter, we thank you that we are so wondrously created and that we are made for relationship with you and with one another. We thank you for laughter with friends and loved ones. We thank you for the laughter of children and the song it creates in our hearts. May we each find the laughter within us that sets our spirits free. And in that freedom, may we take your love into every part of our lives. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So here's where we've been. I think most of you have been here for some of the talks. Earlier, we talked about King Solomon and his role as this wisdom figure behind the book of Proverbs, but that the wisdom is also even explicitly attributed to other people in the book. We'll see a passage that's attributed to Agur today. We talked about wealth and poverty and how there's a kind of tension between Proverbs that show this connection between wisdom and wealth, that if you're wise, that if you work hard or you're righteous, you'll be wealthy, but others that take a more skeptical view towards wealth and also that counsel the importance of helping the poor. Last time we talked about Proverbs in ancient Near Eastern wisdom. We looked a little bit at the Proverbs of Amenemope, an Egyptian text, and saw some similarities and differences, and just talked about how we today think about incorporating wisdom from outside our tradition as we're thinking about the development of wisdom. Today we're doing humor and humility, and next week we'll talk about women and wisdom. So this may look thematic, and it is, but there's also a kind of literary, we're kind of also roughly going through the book in literary order as well. So the first week I was focusing on the first 9 chapters of the book. The wealth and poverty part mostly came from that first Solomonic collection in chapters 10 to 22. Proverbs and ancient Near Eastern wisdom, we were looking mostly at around Proverbs 22 to 24. Today, mostly we'll be looking at Proverbs 25, 26, and then especially Proverbs 30. And next week we'll take a close look at the Proverbs 31 woman at that very end of the book. Proverbs 30, which is kind of the main big text we'll focus on today, is something I've wrote a couple of things on. One is an essay that appears in this book, Speaking with God, about Old Testament prayers. My chapter is on Agur's prayer, which is in Proverbs 37 through 9. It's the only prayer in Proverbs. Usually it's understood as a prayer, and that's unusual for the book of Proverbs. So I have an essay in that book. I also have a forthcoming article on humor and animal imagery in Proverbs 30. So some of that is drawn from that. That probably won't be published till next year, but if you're interested, I can send it to you. All right, I've asked you to think about this question all along. Every week in my series, what does wisdom look like in my everyday life as we're going through Lent and thinking about that. My sub-questions here are, how does humor help to develop wisdom? I don't think we often think of humor in terms of wisdom or morality, but I think there actually is a helpful role there. And a question I ask myself often, am I taking myself too seriously? I think Proverbs uses humor to, for one thing, poke fun at the proud or other kinds of moral issues, evil things that kind of pokes fun at them, but also encourages us to look at ourselves and kind of be able to take a joke and not take ourselves too seriously. And I actually think for me, this kind of has a moral force to kind of diffuse things that if I'm getting angry, worked up, or stressed. Sometimes if I take a step back and look at kind of the absurdity of my situation, I realize, oh, maybe I can handle this without taking myself so seriously. So first, I'm going to just show us where the word for laughter appears in Proverbs, because the word explicitly comes up a few times, so that can tell us something of how Proverbs sees laughter. both on positive and negative sides. Then we'll look at a few Proverbs that I think might be humorous. You may or may not agree with me, but I think they might be humorous. And then we'll take a look at Proverbs 30 and this strange figure of Agur, who that section is attributed to, and how humor and animal imagery are used to really develop this theme of humility towards the end of the book. All right, so there's a word in Hebrew, sahak, that's the verbal form for laughter, but it can also be translated play and also other things. It's a related root to another word, sahak, which is in the name Isaac. So if you remember back Abraham's son Isaac, there's a lot of wordplay around that, the playing and laughing, because Sarah laughs when she hears that she's going to have a baby. She's kind of laughing with scorn, but then there's more joyful laughter, and so Isaac's name is related to that. But the word comes up in the book of Proverbs, first time in chapter 1. This is kind of interesting. So this is woman wisdom speaking right at the beginning of the book, and she's talking about how she's calling out to all these people to turn from their foolish ways, but they're not turning. And then she says, since you refuse to listen when I call, and no one pays attention when I stretch out my hand, since you disregard all my advice and do not accept my rebuke, I in turn will laugh when disaster strikes you. I will mock when calamity overtakes you. This is kind of striking, woman wisdom laughing at the downfall of the foolish. Similar things, words, this laughter and mocking pair are also used about God in a couple Psalms about God laughing also at the downfall of the wicked. So we have here the first instance of laughter is this kind of scornful laughter for the people who don't listen to wisdom, and then they kind of get what they deserve. But then the next instance is a text we looked closely at this Proverbs 8. We have this wisdom. This is again woman wisdom speaking in the context of creation. And she says, I was filled with delight day after day, playing, or often translated rejoicing, but it's the same word, laughing, always in God's presence, playing in his whole world and delighting in humankind. So here again, the next time we see laughter or play, or however you want to translate this, it's wisdom delighting in this positive way in God, in creation, in humankind.
I'm sorry, but I think this passage, but since you refuse to listen when I call and no one pays attention, when I stretch out my hand since you disregard my advice and do not accept, I will laugh. To me that is totally against the essence of Christianity. I'm horrified. I'm sorry. I just, that to me just destroys everything I understand about Christianity and being a God-loving, understanding person.
Thank you for that. Yes, on one level, I agree. It's a troubling image of this figure who is close to God, could even be seen as an attribute of God, laughing about the downfall of the wicked, when, for example, Jesus says to love our enemies.
It's like bratty kids on the playground.
So I agree in a sense. I think, for example, when I think of this as perspective as a parent, and if I told my kids not to do something and then they did it, I wouldn't laugh at them. That would be bad. But when I think of it on the level of, say, very powerful people who are persisting in using power and their wealth to make life terrible for a lot of people. And they know that it's wrong, they know that they're misusing their power, and that they're accumulating wealth off the backs of other people. And then, say that person, something happens and they lose their wealth, and the stock tanks, and they're left in the position of all these people that they oppressed.
But they were also providing jobs for people.
Okay, well that. I'm talking about. This is just a thought experiment. Okay, think of an evil person who's not doing any social good, and then they have a downfall. Isn't there something, if we have a sense of this underlying justice that we want to be there in the world, that we feel joy in their downfall, that there's a sense that we can feel joy in their downfall because it's showing us that, that there is some underlying justice in the world. Reed?
Well, I was just going to say, it reminds me of the word schadenfreude.
Yeah, I thought that too, Schadenfreude. It's a biblical basis for Schadenfreude. I guess I agree with Claire that this should not be our normal reaction to things going bad for people. But I think there is a sense, like I said, when you see justice being done, that you're justified in feeling happy about that. You can disagree. Let's look at some other examples. Okay.
You can use a really specific example, like when Hitler failed, everybody rejoiced. And it would be a normal response to rejoice when Hitler fails, and when a really evil person with tremendous power and cruelty fails in their operation. We don't just say, oh, that's too bad. We rejoice.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce. Yes, it does help to be more specific. Okay, here's one from just the short proverb collections, and this one will ruin all your April Fool's Day plans for Tuesday. Like a maniac shooting flaming arrows of death is one who deceives their neighbor and says, I was only joking. It's the same word here. This one, I think, it shows the kind of destructive or negative side of laughter, but also just kind of on a meta level, it's a funny problem because it's kind of an exaggeration, this maniac shooting flaming arrows of death. And I think my husband Jonathan can relate to this one. He does not like practical jokes. So I told the kids to play any practical jokes should come to me on April Fool's Day. And I try to keep this one in mind, honey. If a wise person goes to court with a fool, the fool rages and laughs, and there's no peace. So again, here we have laughter, kind of a negative side associated with foolishness, and I guess maybe just sometimes this is translated scoffs or something. I'm not sure what we're supposed to imagine is happening in the court, but something that you're not getting very far with this, taking this to court. And then the final one, I think is interesting, is in this passage we'll look at next week about the woman, the noble wife, the woman of valor, I call her. She's clothed with strength and dignity. She laughs at the days to come. So as we'll see next week, this woman is a kind of incarnation of woman wisdom. And so it's interesting to me that woman wisdom is laughing in chapter 1 with scorn. This woman also is kind of laughing with scorn at the days to come, but it's a kind of positive image. She's not laughing at anybody, but she's laughing because she's confident in the future. And she's not worrying about the future. So this is all the times that the word laughter occurs in the book of Proverbs. And so interesting to me that it's connected both with wisdom and with folly, even in its negative and positive, like the scornful laughter and a more positive, joyful laughter is associated with wisdom, and also that kind of only negative, I guess, associated with fools. But I think, we can see that in our lives, that laughter, humor, it can be put to good ends, it can be put to bad ends. If there's a negative side, there's a positive side, and that's what we see here. We'll take a look at a few proverbs that I want to argue are funny. It's very hard, just even today, one person will find something funny, and another person, exact same cultural context, will not find it funny. So when you're talking about, ancient times, totally different cultural context, to say something is funny or not, it's very difficult. But there's some that I find funny. One of the main theories of humor is called incongruity theory. That's probably the most accepted theory of humor. There's multiple theories of what makes something funny. The incongruity theory is based on this idea that humor is based on something that when our expectations are subverted, or something is surprising or absurd and unexpected. So like that famous line, "Take my wife, please." Like you think it's saying "take my wife" like as an example, but then when it says "please," you realize it's saying something totally different that you didn't expect. And there's a lot of refinements of this theory. I don't want to get into it, but I do think you see that kind of incongruity in some of these. Here's one: a whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools. So it's this list of animals. You might think a rod for an ox or something, but a rod for the back of fools, and comparing the fools to the animals. Whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. This one I think is just kind of funny because like the arrow, the first madman shooting arrows. It's like, that's just an extreme example. Like you send a message by a fool and you're cutting off your own feet. I don't know, it's an exaggeration. Maybe you don't think it's funny, but I think it's funny. This one is a well-known one. Maybe not funny, maybe just gross, but like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. I mean, it's such a striking image, the dog returning to its vomit. It's gross, but it's also kind of like absurd, this fool repeating his folly. This one, maybe not super PC, but I think it's funny. It's better to live in a corner of a housetop than a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. It's like, I mean, in ancient Israel, the rooftops are flat, so it would be possible to live on a corner of a house, but it's not realistic. Like what guy is sitting on, would sit on a corner of a house, and it's just, again, a kind of exaggeration, that like, oh, it's better to live on a corner of a housetop than a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. It's just kind of extreme. And there's another one about a quarrelsome wife. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. And then comparing the wife to a continual dripping. Maybe you don't think this funny, but I don't know.
I'm sure if women were writing the Proverbs, we'd get some
You
pretty
get
funny
a
ones.
different right. You get a different one. I mean, I do think about this a little bit sometimes, like, oh, am I doing something that makes Jonathan want to live at the corner of the housetop? I think he's saying no, but I don't know. It's just it's a funny image to me that like this quarrelsome wife is driving the husband out to the corner of his housetop, or she's like a continual dripping. Yesterday when I was getting the material ready, I thought, like, wouldn't this be hilarious if I got Jonathan like a mug that said it's better to live on the corner of the house than a quarrelsome wife, but it's not available. I cannot find it. So, thank you, Jason. All right. This one I showed you on the first day, if you were here. I thought it was funny ever since I was a kid. If anyone loudly blesses their neighbor early in the morning, it will be taken as a curse. I just think that's hilarious that, people going around cheering morning people are annoying their neighbors. All right, just a couple more. This is a whole section on lazy people, and the laziness, that's funny. And part of it, I don't know, you can kind of recognize it in yourself too. The lazy person says, there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. It's like why are they saying that? They don't want to go out. Like, there's no lion. But they're just making an excuse to stay home and do nothing. As a door turns on its hinges, so a lazy person turns on his bed. That's a funny image, And also funny that, like, you think ancient Israel, they're, busting their butt in the field and stuff, but apparently they had lazy people turning back and forth in bed, too. A lazy person buries his hand in the dish. It wears him to bring it back to his mouth. So he's like too lazy to even eat. I always show this GIF in class to illustrate this one. No. I'm too tired. One more time. And then a lazy person is wiser in his own eyes than 7 people are in his own eyes. All right. So hopefully I've convinced you that some of those proverbs are at least a little funny and poking fun at, vices like laziness or pride. Anyone have questions or comments before we go on to Proverbs 30? Okay. So Proverbs 30 has the heading, the words of Agur, and it's just the whole chapter has a lot of strange features. And a lot of unexpected things in the book of Proverbs. I won't have time to go through all the details, but I'll highlight some texts that I think are important for this theme of humility and the ways that it uses humor and animal imagery to develop this theme of humility. So the words of Agur, son of Yahweh, the oracle, the utterance of the man. That's the first verse. But we don't know who Agur is. No one else in the Bible has named this. We don't know who Yahweh, his father, is. Nobody in the Bible has named that. So before, the headings in Proverbs have been Solomon. We've seen the Proverbs of Solomon 2 times. We saw a heading with the words of the Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah copied, so we know that's the king, Hezekiah. We also have the words of the wise. That was the heading on the material we looked at last time. But here we have a heading of somebody we just don't know, Agur. We don't know him, so that's kind of weird for one thing. In this book of Solomonic wisdom, the Proverbs of Solomon, who's this unknown guy, who's not a king, nobody knows who he is. Also, the oracle, that's very strange. That's usually used about prophetic oracles that people get from God. The utterance of the man is also a strange phrase. Almost always when this word utterance is used, it's followed by the divine name, the utterance of the Lord, and it's in prophetic literature. So like the Lord says, thus says the Lord. Here's the utterance of the man. That exact phrase is very rare, but it does occur in the Balaam oracles, and I'll talk a bit about Balaam. So Balaam is this non-Israelite prophet in the book of Numbers, and there's a famous story with his donkey, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. The phrase, the utterance of the man, is in the Balaam oracles. The next part of verse 1 is just so textually difficult that we really don't know what it says for sure. So how it's vocalized in the Masoretic text in Hebrew is makes it look like names. So he's saying this to Ithiel, and Uchal, but those aren't. At least Uchal is not a known name. It's weird that he would say it twice. There's kind of problems with that name thing. So a lot of people redivide the letters and read them as verbal forms. In that case, he's saying, I am weary, O God, I am weary, O God, and worn out. Anyway, that's kind of strange. This guy, we don't know who he is. He's giving this oracle, and the oracle is, I'm weary, O God, and I'm worn out. So the whole thing is just weird. It doesn't sound like other things we've had in Proverbs. Then he says, for I'm more beast than man. Some translation says, I say I'm more brutish than a man. That's also strange. He's this animal-like figure. That word for beast also could be related to Balaam, the figure I mentioned. Balaam is the son of Beor, and it's the same root for beast. And now Agur says, I don't have human understanding. I have not learned wisdom, nor do I have knowledge of the Holy One. So this is also very strange, right? We've had this wisdom book. The whole point of the book, as we see in just the introduction that we looked at before, the whole point in this Solomonic wisdom book is to know wisdom and instruction, to discern words of understanding. All these words, knowledge, wisdom, instruction, I guess that one doesn't show up, but wisdom, instruction, understanding, Agur is saying he doesn't have that. And so the whole, the program of the book is to learn wisdom, and also mentions in that first 9 chapters that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So that's the only other place where we see that phrase, knowledge of the Holy One, in the book of Proverbs. It's associated with wisdom, with fear of the Lord. So why do we have this guy saying he's worn out, he doesn't have wisdom? After you read through the whole book, and now you get to this guy who says, I don't have wisdom, I don't have understanding. It's like the whole program of the book failed. What is this guy doing here? So it's just a very strange passage. In the next verses, he talks about how nobody's able to go up to heaven, this kind of distance between humans and God. And then he has this prayer that is, as I told you, the only prayer in the book of Proverbs. He says, 2 things I ask of you, do not withhold them before I die. Keep falsehood and lying words from me. Do not give me poverty or riches. Tear off from me the bread of my portion, lest I be sated and act deceptively and say, who is Yahweh? Or lest I become poor and steal and profane the name of my God. So a few interesting things about this prayer. One thing is that when we talked about poverty, wealth and poverty, this is an interesting piece to put into that because he doesn't see wealth or poverty as desirable. He wants a kind of, a middle path of moderation, because if you're rich, you can be satisfied and deny God any place in your life. If you're poor, you might steal, and that would also be a kind of rebellion against God. So it's a kind of interesting distinction to the wisdom, or the earlier wisdom in Proverbs that associates wisdom and wealth together. In terms of the animal theme, it's usually not translated this way. Usually says give me the bread of my portion, but this tear off from me the bread of my portion, it uses this verb taraf that's almost always in the Bible used about animals tearing prey. So it's interesting that he's saying, I'm a beast, I'm more of a beast than a man, asking God to, almost using this animal imagery for God, tear off from me the bread of my portion. And just interesting, and he's in this place of vulnerability, of weariness, of unwisdom, and so he asks God this very practical kind of prayer that, give me my daily bread. Some people think that the daily bread in Jesus, the Lord's Prayer, is coming from this, the bread of my portion, in this prayer. Anyway, just kind of continuing that animal imagery and this image of this person who's weary and tired out. Did you have something?
Just not to overstress the semicolons that don't appear in Hebrew. He's asking actually for three things, not two. What do you think of that?
So, keep falsehood in line, words for me, don't give me poverty, and riches tear off the bread of my portion history.
I mean, you could argue that the third request is embedded in the second, but it is different, related. But what do you make of the fact that he's really asking for three things? The daily bread.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I see the daily bread as part of the not giving poverty or riches, but I do think something that's interesting, if you just read through this whole chapter, there's a lot of numerical sayings, and sometimes the numerical sayings have like a 3-4 pattern. So 3 things are insatiable, 4 never say enough, 3 things are beyond me, 4 I can't fathom. But some of the numerical sayings aren't like that. Like 4 are among the tiniest of the earth, yet they're the wisest of the wise. And there's also like a riddling character to this text as well. So maybe there's, if you see 3, I mean, I think it's possible to understand it as 2 things, but if you see 3, there might be like a subtle 2-3 pattern, just like we have the 3-4 pattern in some of the other Proverbs. That's possible. The whole thing, like I said, has this kind of riddling quality to it.
It would seem to me that the tear off for me part of the sentence is an illustration of neither poverty nor wealth.
That's
it's
what
just
I would
a
see,
reasonable portion.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, not to get into a big argument, I take both your points. I also think there's something intrinsically humorous and about saying 2 things I ask and then asking for 3.
Maybe so. Maybe it's part of his humility, but trying to just slip another one in there. That's interesting. Yeah, this is kind of the end of a unit, and people debate how much of this to attribute to Agur, but he begins probably by saying, I'm weary, O God, I'm weary, O God, I'm worn out, then this prayer. And then the rest of the chapter are a bunch of sayings. Many of them are numerical. I see the whole thing as a kind of Agur unit, but it kind of changes character a little bit after this passage. And we get, soon after this, these words about a wicked generation. This isn't really a numerical saying, but it does have 4 different kind of illustrations about this generation, without any kind of conclusion. It's just like a generation. That's the first word of every line. A generation, and then a description of the generation. So this generation, they curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. That's very bad and very consistent with other things in Proverbs about honoring your parents, listening to your parents' wisdom. A generation pure in its own eyes, but its excrement isn't washed. I don't know if this is humorous, but I kind of wonder if it's a bit of a poop joke. It's pure in its own eyes, and they have poop on themselves. Like their excrement isn't washed off. That's a kind of funny image. And they think they're so pure, but they're actually very, very dirty. Then it talks about their eyes are lifted up, and this is a big theme in this chapter, pride. So a generation, how high its eyes and its eyelids are lifted up. Later in the chapter, we're not going to look at this verse, but you hear soon after, in verse 17, it says, the eye that mocks a father and disdains the homage due a mother. So here we see this eye again, and the eyes are mocking the father and mother. What's going to happen? The ravens of the brook will gouge it out, and the children of eagles will devour it. So here we don't see anything about any consequences for this generation, but later we see this, the people with these haughty eyes are going to have their eyes eaten out by ravens and birds of prey. And then here I think we see some animal imagery, although it's not explicit. A generation whose teeth are swords and whose jaws are butcher knives to devour the poor from the land and the needy from among mortals. The language about the teeth being swords, the jaws being butcher knives, often elsewhere used of lions in the Bible. So it's these kind of lion-like people who are devouring their prey. And so we've had kind of a couple different uses of animal imagery so far in this passage. You have Agur saying he's a beast, more than a person. Now we have these people who are behaving like animals. You see a little bit more in a couple other verses there. But then when we get towards the end of the chapter, animal imagery used a little bit differently and in kind of a positive way. So we've seen kind of Agur in his weary situation, he's a beast. Then there's people who act like beasts, that's a negative thing. But now we see this kind of positive picture of animals as wise. And instead of describing animals as people as animals, here we have animals described as people. So it says 4 things are the smallest of the earth, but they're the wisest of the wise. That's saying something, that these small animals are wise. Ants are a people, not strong. So now ants are a people, like I said, in this reversal of people being animals, but they prepare their bread in the summer. Badgers are a people, not mighty, but they make their home in the rock. A king the locust does not have, but all of them go out in formation. The lizard can be caught in the hands, but she's in the palaces of a king. So this is really interesting, I think, in terms of the message that it's giving. You start out with this ant. The ants aren't strong, but they prepare their bread in the summer. So the ants look like, this industrious folk that are preparing their food. And this is actually seems to be a variation on an earlier proverb in the Solomonic collection, Proverbs 6. This is explicitly framed as an instruction to the lazy person, the sluggard. That's the same word as the lazy person in my other passages. Go to the ant, O sluggard, look at her ways and become wise. Without having a chief, an official, or a ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food at the harvest. So it's almost the same idea that she's gathering her food. And what's just an interesting little detail is this word for gather. It's from the verb agar. Same root that seems to show up in Agur's name. And it's only appears 3 times in Proverbs. The only other time it's about a son who's gathering his food, or like a righteous son who's gathering his food. So same root as Agur's name. So anyway, this ant picture is an industrious ant. They're working hard. Seems to be a lesson for humans. But as we go down the list, it gets harder to see the lesson for humans, I think. So badgers, they're making their home in the rock, so maybe they're resourceful, you could say that's the message for humans. The last 2 have the word king at the beginning and end in Hebrew, and I try to reproduce that here. And interesting, so I think interesting, we have this non-royal figure speaking these words in contrast to Solomon. And perhaps like a bit of a gentle critique of kingship. Here we have the locusts. They don't have kings, and they still can go out in formation. If you're looking for a lesson for humans here, it doesn't. You wouldn't think it's that people are supposed to go out in formation in their armies without any kind of leaders over them. Maybe the lesson is, well, even if they don't have locusts can do it without a king, how much more should humans be able to march out in formation with a king? Maybe that's the lesson. But when we get to the end about the lizard, here I think it's, to me, very hard to find a lesson for humans. The lizard, she's just hanging out in the palace. Did she do something to get there? Not really. She lives there. And this contrast to all the other people who are striving to get close to the king, to do the right thing behave well in front of the king, to reach a high position of power, all these people striving for that position, and the lizards, they're just there, they're hanging out. And then, so I think by the end of this proverb, the message is maybe not so much that the animals are teaching these wise lessons to the humans, but that animals can sometimes do things that people can't. And there's actually a lot of contemporary books published these days about all the amazing things that animals can do that people can't, and that we don't even understand, like bird navigation. We don't even despite the advances of science, we don't really know how some birds manage to go back to nesting grounds that they've never even lived at themselves, for example. And there's so many examples of that about octopi and all these animals that can do things that humans can't. And so I wonder if there's a bit of just a kind of saying animals are wisest of the wise. Some animals can do things humans can't, and it kind of relativizes some of this human pride, human striving. Yes.
The lesson that I'm seeing is sort of like, even if you're in the protection of a king, anything can happen to you, you can still be caught.
Mm-hmm.
Is sort of how I read that, so I don't know if that's something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think to me, the caught is like, well, a lizard can be caught in the hands. In some ways, she's a very vulnerable little creature, and like humans are more powerful than her in that they can catch her like that. But on the other hand, all these humans who would like to live in the palace are not living there, and she's living there without really doing anything. I think there's a bit of a funny image if we think back to this passage that we looked at on the first week, when we have Solomon. We hear that Solomon spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And so we hear Solomon giving these nature lectures, which I think on the one, it's cool, pretty cool. So it's like Solomon the scientist. But if we think of this lizard, hanging out, listening to him, and she's there too. To me, it's a bit of a kind of, like I said, a bit of a relativization of human power, of human striving for status and things like that. And also, so this is kind of developed further, I think, in this proverb about those stately of stride that comes soon after this. This is towards the end of the chapter. It's almost the end of the chapter. And it has some textual difficulties, so it's a little bit hard to see what it's saying, but it says, 3 things are stately of step, 4 stately of stride. So this is that 3-4 pattern that I was talking about. So first you have the lion. The lion is the mightiest of all the beasts. He retreats from nothing. And then you have the strutting rooster, which is textually difficult if that's really the translation, but it's the best option probably that we have, that it means rooster, or a he-goat, and then a king. And then the last part of the line is also textually difficult. It might be a king no one dares to resist. It could be a king with his army. There's a lot of different readings. Anyway, so we have to be kind of tentative about the meaning of this because there's a couple of really textual difficulties. But most people have read this as a kind of laudatory statement about all the people, all the creatures on this list. They're all kind of the kings of their domain, and they're all stately of stride and noble of step. But I think just the order of this, it's interesting. We start with the lion. The lion's the mightiest of the beasts. He retreats from nothing. So here we have this, this very noble beast. But then a rooster strutting around trying to get attention, and a goat. I mean, these are 2 animals that are, kind of strutting around trying to get female attention. And then the last on the list is a king. It's in the order from king, rooster, goat, or lion, rooster, goat, king, may not be flattering to the king, especially because the next verse is about pride. Again, that theme of pride. It says, if you have been foolish by exalting yourself, put your hand on your mouth, basically kind of stop what you're doing. And so we had in the 4 animals picture, this maybe gentle poke at kings with the locusts do fine without a king. The lizard is hanging out in the palaces of a king. Now here we have a king following the rooster and the goat, and also, followed by this thing that says, don't be proud. And so I think there might be, like I said, a little bit of this might not be a flattering statement to kings. That kings are being compared not so much to a lion, but to a strutting rooster and a goat. There's other people who read it this way as well. Somebody wrote a whole dissertation recently on humor in Proverbs 30, which I didn't know when I was working on this paper originally. Jason?
You might be getting there, but so if this entire wisdom tradition / book is attributed to a king,
Yeah.
what do you make of including this at the end? Is this like a final little jab? Is it a correction to all of it? Is it another take?
Yeah, I am getting to it.
Okay.
And it's yes, but it's a very important question. So okay. I think it could be, I don't think I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a subversion. But it's kind of all of those things. And I have comments on it.
Okay.
Bill, did you have some?
Well, I don't want to interrupt the thread, but is there any distinction between step and stride that we should infer, given the fact it's 3-4?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just a parallel terms. So I see a kind of analogy here. If this is a kind of humorous dig at a king strutting around using animal imagery, there's a kind of, I would say, somewhat similar thing going on with there's these memes about the riding Putin. So this is one of the original pictures. Putin is, he originally has these pictures of him on a horse to show, his manliness, his strength. But people have made other versions of it, like the shark, the kitten, all these. And, subverting that original image that was meant to show strength, now using animals to poke fun at that, king who was trying to use animals to be strong. I see as sort of analogous to what might be going on in that. Okay, so now to that question of what's going on here. I'll bring it back to the Balaam story for part of this. So I mentioned that there's seem to be some really distinct verbal connections between Agor's words and the Balaam story. Again, Balaam is this non-Israelite prophet, and he does act as this spokesperson, mouthpiece for God in delivering these oracles. But you have this strange, and most people think humorous, story about him and his donkey. He's riding along. He's called a seer. He's a seer. His eyes open, it says in his oracles. So he's a person who sees clearly. But when he's going along on his donkey, there's an angel of the Lord standing in front of him that he doesn't see, and only his donkey sees it. And so he keeps beating his donkey to try to get to go, and the donkey's not going anywhere because she sees there's an angel in the way, and he doesn't see it. So the seer who's blind, where the donkey's eyes are open. And I mean, the dialogue, I think, is funny. Balaam's yelling at his donkey, and he says, "You've made a fool of me. If I only had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." And then the donkey is able to talk, one of only two talking animals in the Bible, the serpent in the Garden of Eden and the Balaam's donkey. And the donkey says, "Am I not your own donkey, which you've always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" What, you think I'm not seeing anything here? There's a reason I'm doing this. And Balaam just says, "No." And so Balaam, and then his eyes are open and he sees the angel. But the donkey is the real visionary here. And the donkey can see when the prophet is blind. And like I said, many people see this as a humorous story. I wonder if some of these allusions to the Balaam story in the words of Agor might be comparing these two figures who are kind of, put in their place by animals in a way. So there's lots of kind of animals putting people in their place in Proverbs 30, just like Balaam was put in place by his donkey. The difference here, I think, would be that the figure of Agor, he knows his position. That's why he says, I'm a beast. So he can kind of see more clearly than Balaam his similarity to animals and not be proud. But I do wonder if there's a kind of deliberately evoking this story, this ultimate story of animals putting humans in their place in the Balaam story. And to come back to Jason's point about what all this, what's the point of all this? I think there's a lot going on, but I do think that when you get to the end of the book, you have this unknown figure of Agor. The point of having somebody there who's saying, "I don't know anything, I'm beastly," is on one hand, it's a correction not really a correction of Solomon, the Solomon Proverbs, but a correction of a kind of misappropriation of that to say like, okay, I'm getting wiser and wiser, now I'm wise, and I'm great. And so I think it's a correction of that like you can't get to the end of that journey and think that you're wise and think that you're great. It's just and it's jarring because he's weary, he's a beast, I don't know anything, and all these kind of striking images too, and the use of animals to kind of put people in their place. I do think it's a kind of it's a corrective against pride, the pride that might come from gaining wisdom, and I think those of us in the world of academia can see that. People sometimes they learn and and gain pride. Other people learn and realize how much they don't know. That's a kind of feature of proper learning, I think, is that you realize how much you don't know as you're learning. But some people learn and think that they're really great because they learned a lot of stuff. In terms of Agor's relationship with Solomon and the kind of the Solomonic wisdom, I do think there is a kind of gentle dig at kings here. The point, I don't think it's anti-monarchical or anti-Solomon or something, but the message to me is that if even kings, who are the greatest people in the society, if even kings shouldn't be proud, Even a figure like Solomon doesn't have all the wisdom in the world. Like, how much more all of us? So the message is really for everybody, not just kings. And I think of Agur. I wonder if the play on the ant proverb, because Agur seems to be deliberately drawing on that Solomonic version of the ant proverb, and even his name is possibly a little cipher for that, the connection with that ant, is that this text is kind of deliberately following up on the Solomonic proverbs, deliberately kind of playing on those, riffing on those, but in a kind of different key, a different viewpoint. And I think it's, to me, very analogous to the book of Ecclesiastes, which has, I have taught on here before. So Ecclesiastes, the speaker in that book is called Kohelet. Actually, interestingly, Kohelet, the verb is kahal, which also means to gather, which is also what Agar means. So Kohelet, it never says Solomon's name, but if you've read Ecclesiastes, if you know something about it, you know that it's a Solomon-like figure, a Solomon-like voice. But the wisdom in the book is very different from what you get in Proverbs. And so Ecclesiastes, the Kohelet voice, is like a kind of alternative Solomon voice, exploring wisdom from another angle. And I think that's kind of what Agur is too. It's like an alternative wisdom voice, giving a different perspective that's not in contradiction to the Solomonic wisdom, but that is a corrective to a misreading of it. And so that we have this kind of non-royal sage who's he may even be like a hidden Solomon or something, but he may just be a kind of non-royal voice speaking into this voice of royal wisdom. So I think humor, it's used a lot of different ways in this book. Sometimes it pokes fun at the proud, it pokes fun at fools, lazy people. But ultimately, the point isn't just to like laugh at other people. The point is to see your own kind of foibles and your own mistakes and be able to laugh at yourself. And that, I think that when we are in on the joke, we're kind of getting that humor in Proverbs, and that's one way of acquiring wisdom and knowing wisdom. And I think it's not focused on a lot in the book of Proverbs, but the idea that wisdom involves humility, but it is seen a lot in other parts of Scripture that a key part of wisdom is humility. And so most of the book of Proverbs really emphasizes that you can get wisdom, you can acquire it. You know, the woman wisdom is out there calling on the street, wanting everyone to listen to her. It's something you can really acquire, you can really get. But then other parts of Scripture, Job, Ecclesiastes, and here, kind of caution against thinking that you can actually grasp wisdom. So there's a bit of a, I think, productive tension. You can get wisdom, and you can't get wisdom, and both are really true. And I think it's interesting to see that within the book of Proverbs. We don't often think of the book of Proverbs teaching that. Bill?
Well, I'm just wondering if what you're sketching out for us is a kind of interdependence between natural theology, humor today, and humility. That we can only grasp the glimpse of God's wisdom, of God's order that allows the lizard to live in a palace. If we have a sense of humor about our own place in that order, and if we don't have humility, we're not going to be able to hold that lightly or firmly.
Right. Yes, I think that's true. And I think I'm doing a project on the divine speeches in Job right now, and God talks about animals in this very non-anthropocentric way, and really focusing on the animals and each living their own life, pretty much apart from humans. And it's not exactly the same message, but I think it's another similar message. And like I said, a lot of people doing work in stuff on animals today and animal ethics and stuff point to some of those things, these whole animal worlds that we're only beginning to understand. We've kind of imagined ourselves on the top of this hierarchy that now we can see through science, but we already have hints of it in the Bible that animals sometimes can do a lot of things that humans can't. It depends on what metrics we're using to measure things like intelligence.
Yeah. I should just mention that if anybody hasn't seen it, and this isn't a wholesale recommendation, but the current season of White Lotus includes a quotation quotation from Proverbs 30. And it's the specific question of the lizard in the palace.
Thank you. Yes.
There was a definition of humor, a succinct definition that I heard from Malcolm Muggeridge, the humorist who spoke at the Gordon College commencement the year after I graduated. And it goes something like, the essence of humor is the disparity between human aspiration and human performance. And it's so succinct, and for almost 50 years I've tried it out. And it's been right every time. And it definitely fits in with seeing the purpose. Why create humor is to make us see that about ourselves.
Yeah.
The humility part. And that's why he attached this pleasurable laughter to it. All pleasures in life, they lead us to hopefully to good things like food, etc.
Yeah.
But that pleasure of laughter, and I've noticed most laughter is not attached to humor. It's attached to nervousness.
That's interesting. Well, you do see this whole range of positive and negative laughter even in the book of Proverbs. But yeah, that is really appropriate. And I think we often don't think of humor's resources for ethics and morality and teaching, but there is actually a lot there to me. So other comments or questions? Yes.
Oh, on the step and stride slide,
Yeah.
what I was seeing was you had these animal groups that move about, like how the male lion, strides purposefully and authority and viewing his pride. And same with, I think, the goat would do, just like this. How, is that what it was saying? It was like how the king would move about, and then
I think, on the positive, if
for
you
the
look at,
rooster, like, hey, this is my domain.
I think, yeah, a lot of people have read it as these things are all the masters of their domains, and they're all stately striding around. The point that I'm trying to make is that maybe it's a bit of making fun of kings a little bit. That, like, you would think maybe if you're trying to elevate the king, you would start with the rooster, go to the goat, then the lion, and then the king is like on the top of everything.
Okay.
But instead, the king is closer to the rooster and the goat, which are kind of strutting around for attention versus, the lion seems more noble. So I was trying to make the point that, like, yeah, maybe it's just kind of poking fun at these animals strutting around. Like a king is like a rooster strutting around. Is that really a...
And a rooster and a lion can still trip and fall and make a mistake. So
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Dean?
Yeah, just to follow up on the idea about humor, I find it fascinating that the humorist in society is the person that you go to and you listen to. The comedian who only has a joke, it's transient. The joke is here and then it's gone. But the humorist backs up, takes a look, makes a comment, and it generates a response, very often a bit of laughter, but not the way you hear a joke or you hear a statement that essentially is somewhat veiled in its negativity towards the other person. So you cast aspersions by using the joke as opposed to the humorist.
Yeah, I do think jokes can be used for bad purposes. Obviously, I think the book of Proverbs shows that. And sometimes jokes, are racist. Sometimes jokes are belittling of other people. But then there's, political humor is used, I think, in a similar way sometimes. This is bringing down the crowd, kind of pointing out the foibles of these rich and powerful people. I'm not saying it's all positive, but that it, whatever you call it, it can be used in ways to kind of bring down the crowd and elevate the humble. Jan?
These are times when it's hard to laugh. You have to look for things or pay attention to, or deliberately see where God is overall versus focusing on things that are maddening, frightening, and so on. I have a sister-in-law who sends me something witty or funny every day now. And the one most recently, because it's Lent, was when I'm tempted to eat chocolate, I hear these voices in my head. One of them says, eat the chocolate. The other one says, you heard me, eat the chocolate.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. Well, thanks everybody. We've got one more week next week. Thank you for hanging with me.